The gunshot echoed across the Montana plains as Kathleen Abernathy collapsed onto the freshly dug soil. Her lifeless body sprawled beside her husband's grave. Their two daughters, Faith and Felicity Andrews, clung to each other, trembling as they watched their mother take her final breath, the revolver still warm in her hand. It was 1875, and the harsh reality of frontier life had claimed yet another soul, leaving two young women barely 19 and 21 alone in a world that showed little mercy to those without protection. What do we do now? Faith whispered, her voice breaking as she gripped her older sister's hand. Her golden hair, so like their mother's, whipped around her tear-stained face in the autumn wind. Felicity, taller and more resolute with her chestnut waves and their father's determined jaw, stared at the horizon. "We survive," she answered, though she had no notion how they would manage. The bank had already claimed their small homestead, the only home they'd ever known after their father's debts became known. Their mother, unable to bear the loss of both husband and home, had chosen to join him in death rather than face an uncertain future. 3 days later, the sisters stood at the crossroads outside of Silver Creek, Montana, with nothing but a small trunk of belongings between them and the entire contents of their pockets, amounting to less than $5. "We could try for Helena," Faith suggested, adjusting the bonnet that shielded her face from the biting wind. "I heard there's work there for girls like us." Felicity knew what kind of work awaited young, desperate women in mining towns. She shook her head firmly. "No. We'll find something respectable or starve trying." The stagecoach that rumbled toward them was their last hope, the final conveyance leaving Silver Creek before winter would make travel nearly impossible. The sisters pooled their meager funds for 2 tickets to Durango, a growing cattle town where they'd heard workers were needed. The journey was brutal. 3 days of being jostled alongside travelers who eyed the young women with either pity or predatory interest. Felicity kept one hand on the small knife tucked in her boot and the other protectively around her sister's shoulders. Faith, for her part, maintained a quiet dignity that belied her youth, though her eyes grew more hollowed with each passing mile. When they finally arrived in Durango, the reality of their situation became painfully clear. The town was thriving, but positions for respectable women were few, and those that existed required references they didn't have. "Perhaps we could separate," Faith ventured after their 4th rejection. "Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house might take me on as help, and you could—" "No," Felicity cut her off. "We stay together. That's what Mother would have wanted." Night was falling, and with it, the temperature. The sisters huddled on a bench outside the general store, their trunk beside them, when a gruff voice interrupted their whispered conversation. "You ladies look like you're in need of a situation." Felicity looked up, her hand instinctively moving toward her boot. The man who addressed them was tall and weathered, with a face that had seen its share of sun and hardship. He wasn't young, perhaps in his late 30s, but his eyes held a kindness that made Felicity pause. "I'm Keegan Kirkland," he said, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of wheat touched by frost at the temples. "I run a cattle spread about 10 miles outside town." Faith straightened, hope brightening her features. "Are you hiring, Mr. Kirkland?" The cowboy's expression turned apologetic. "Not exactly, but I heard you asking around. Times are hard for everybody since that drought hit last season." He studied them for a moment. "I lost my housekeeper last month, married a fella from Denver and left me high and dry." Felicity's eyes narrowed. "We're not looking for charity, Mr. Kirkland, and I'm not offering it," he replied evenly. "My place needs tending. The house is falling apart while I'm out with the cattle. Fields need working come spring. I can offer room and board plus a small wage once the next herd sells." The sisters exchanged glances. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter and safety, 2 things that had seemed increasingly out of reach. "How do we know we can trust you?" Felicity asked bluntly. Keegan's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "You don't. But Reverend Walsh over at the church knows me well enough. You're welcome to ask him about my character." He gestured to the building across the street with its modest steeple. "I'll be getting supplies for another hour. You decide." After he walked away, Faith turned to her sister with pleading eyes. "We should at least inquire Felicity. Winter's coming and we have nowhere to go." An hour later, with the reassurance of the kindly reverend that Keegan Kirkland was one of the few decent men left in this territory, the sisters found themselves in the back of a wagon, heading away from town as the first snowflakes began to fall. The journey to Keegan's ranch was made largely in silence. The cowboy seemed content to focus on the darkening trail, occasionally pointing out landmarks or offering brief comments about the territory. Faith, exhausted from days of uncertainty, eventually dozed against Felicity's shoulder. "Your sister's young," Keegan observed quietly. "She's 19, Felicity replied, a defensive edge to her voice. "Old enough to know hardship." Keegan nodded, his expression softening. "Didn't mean anything by it, just that life out here can be harsh. Ranching's no easy task, especially after what you've been through." Felicity studied him in the fading light. "How much did the Reverend tell you about us?" "Enough to know you're running from something painful," he answered. "But your business is your own, I'm not one to pry." As night fully descended, the outline of a substantial ranch house emerged against the starlit sky. It wasn't grand by any measure, but it was solid, a two-story structure with a wide porch and several outbuildings visible in the distance. "Welcome to Sundowner Ranch," Keegan said, drawing the wagon to a halt. "It's not much, but it's home." Inside, the house revealed signs of long-term bachelor habitation. It was clean enough, but sparse and utilitarian, devoid of the touches that made a house a home. A large main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a sturdy table, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace that Keegan immediately set about lighting. "There's 2 bedrooms upstairs," he explained as warmth began to spread through the room. "Mine's downstairs past the pantry. You ladies can have the upper floor to yourselves." Faith, now fully awake, looked around with cautious hope. "It's a fine house, Mr. Kirkland." "Keegan," he corrected gently. "Out here, formality doesn't survive long against practicality." That first night, as the sisters settled into a bedroom that had clearly been unused for some time, Faith allowed herself a small smile. "He seems kind." "Kind doesn't mean safe," Felicity warned, though even she had to admit there was something reassuring about Keegan Kirkland's straightforward manner. "But we'll make this work. It's shelter for the winter at least." The early days at Sundowner Ranch established a tentative rhythm. Keegan would rise before dawn, start the coffee, and head out to tend his cattle. The sisters would awaken to find the pot still warm and a list of suggested tasks for the day always phrased as requests rather than demands. Felicity, determined to prove their worth, attacked the household chores with fierce energy. She scoured years of bachelor neglect from corners, organized chaotic storage spaces, and began planning improvements to make the space more efficient. Faith, naturally drawn to nurturing, focused on cooking and transforming the barren house into something more welcoming. A week into their stay, Keegan returned from town with bolts of fabric, sewing notions, and a shy explanation. "Thought you might want to make curtains or whatnot," he mumbled, clearly uncomfortable with the domesticity of the purchase. "Place could use a woman's touch. 2 women's touches," he corrected hastily. Faith beamed, already imagining the possibilities. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Keegan." Felicity was more reserved. "We'll reimburse you when we can." Keegan shook his head, removing his hat and hanging it by the door with deliberate care. "Told you, room, board, and what improvements you make benefit me as much as you. No debts between us." As November deepened, the first major snowstorm of the season descended on Durango. The ranch became isolated, with drifts piling high against the barn and corral. Keegan worked from dawn until well after dusk, ensuring his cattle had access to feed and unfrozen water. One evening, he returned later than usual, his clothing crusted with ice and his face drawn with fatigue. Faith immediately ushered him to the chair nearest the fire while Felicity poured coffee laced with a splash of whiskey from his personal supply. "You'll work yourself to death at this rate," Felicity admonished, surprising herself with the concern in her voice. Keegan accepted the steaming mug with grateful hands. "Ranching waits for no man, especially not in winter." Then perhaps it's time you accepted more help, Felicity stated firmly. You've been handling the barn and livestock alone, but Faith and I are capable of more than housekeeping. Keegan's expression registered surprise, then consideration. It's hard work out there, dangerous too. So was watching our mother put a bullet in her head after our father died, Felicity said bluntly, ignoring Faith's soft gasp. We're stronger than we look. The next morning, Keegan provided a basic education in ranch management. He showed them how to break ice on troughs, measure feed rations, and identify signs of illness in cattle. Faith took to the gentler tasks caring for the milk cow and chickens, while Felicity discovered an unexpected affinity for the more demanding physical work. The days shortened as December arrived, bringing with it a quiet Christmas that none of them had expected to enjoy. Faith had secretly sewn new shirts for Keegan from fabric remnants, while Felicity had crafted a superior leather holster for his revolver, drawing on skills their father had taught them. Keegan's gift to them was both practical and deeply touching, a small library of books he traveled all the way to Helena to acquire, along with the promise that spring would bring proper wages as he expanded his herd. I've never seen Keegan smile so much, Faith whispered that night as they prepared for bed. He seems lighter somehow. Felicity nodded slowly. Having people around again must be good for him. She paused, arranging her thoughts. The Reverend told me his wife died in childbirth years ago. The baby, too. He's been alone ever since. Faith's expression softened with sympathy. How terrible. No wonder he keeps to himself. We've all had our share of loss, Felicity replied, though she found herself thinking of Keegan's rare smiles with unexpected warmth. January brought brutal cold and a threat neither woman had anticipated. Felicity was checking fence lines, a task she'd taken upon herself, despite Keegan's initial protests, when she spotted riders approaching from the north. 3 men, moving with purpose toward the main house. She abandoned her work and raced back, arriving breathless to find the men already dismounted and confronting Keegan on the porch. Faith stood in the doorway, her posture tense. This land should have been mine after you failed to make that bank payment, one man was saying, his voice carrying on the cold air. He was expensively dressed for the territory, with the arrogant bearing of someone unused to being refused. I made that payment, Thornton, and you know it, Keegan replied evenly, though Felicity could see the rigid set of his shoulders. Judge ruled fair and square. Thornton stepped closer, his hand resting too casually near his holstered pistol. Judges can be convinced to reconsider, especially when a man's circumstances change. His gaze slid toward Faith, then noticed Felicity approaching. I see you've acquired some help. Felicity reached the porch, deliberately positioning herself beside Faith. Is there a problem, Keegan? The cowboy's jaw tightened. No problem. Mr. Thornton was just leaving. Thornton smiled unpleasantly. Actually, I've only just arrived. Perhaps your employees might offer some hospitality while we discuss business. They're not servants, Keegan stated flatly, and we have no business to discuss. One of Thornton's companions, a man with cold eyes and a jagged scar across his cheek, spat into the snow. Getting mighty high and mighty for a rancher one bad season away from ruin, Felicity stepped forward. I believe Mr. Kirkland asked you to leave. Thornton's amusement vanished. You should teach your women better manners, Kirkland. They're not my women, Keegan replied, his voice dangerously soft. They're my partners, and you're trespassing. The confrontation ended without violence that day, but Thornton's parting words hung in the air. Spring's coming, Kirkland. Best consider your position carefully before then. That evening, over a subdued dinner, Felicity demanded answers. Who was that man, and why does he think he has a claim on Sundowner? Keegan sighed, pushing his plate away. Marcus Thornton. Owns the biggest spread north of here and half the businesses in town. He's had his eye on my water rights for years. But why would he think you'd failed to make a payment? Faith asked, concern creasing her brow. Because he paid the bank manager to lose my payment last spring, Keegan explained. Took 3 months and nearly every penny I had to fight it in court. Judge ruled in my favor, but it left me without enough to hire help for the season. Felicity's eyes narrowed, so when we arrived, I was desperate, Keegan admitted. Not for housekeeping, though that's been a blessing, but the ranch needs more hands than mine to survive. Come spring, I'm planning to expand the herd, maybe add some crops, without help. He trailed off, the implication clear. You should have told us, Felicity said, her voice sharp with realization. We're not charity cases, Keegan. We're working for our keep. And doing more than I had any right to expect, he countered. You've transformed this place in ways I never imagined. Faith reached across the table, placing her hand gently on Keegan's. We're grateful for your kindness, truly. But Felicity's right, we want to be true partners in this endeavor. If Sundowner prospers, we all benefit. Keegan's gaze moved between the sisters, finally settling on Felicity with an intensity that made her breath catch. You have my word. From now on, complete honesty between us. February melted into March, bringing the first hints of spring thaw and new tensions to Sundowner. True to his promise, Keegan began teaching Felicity and Faith everything about ranch management, from financial records to breeding plans for the cattle. Felicity discovered that their benefactor had been clever in his investments, focusing on breeding stock rather than quantity. His small herd was of superior quality, promising excellent returns if they could expand successfully. Your father was a farmer, Keegan asked one evening as they reviewed his ledgers by lamplight. Faith had already retired, leaving them alone in the comfortable quiet of the kitchen. Felicity nodded, not looking up from the figures she was calculating. He tried. The drought took our crops 3 years running. The debts piled up. Keegan was silent for a moment. My father was the same, never quite made it work. Difference was, he taught me his mistakes alongside his knowledge. Our father taught us to be strong, Felicity replied softly, and our mother taught us to endure. She finally met his gaze, until she couldn't anymore. You carry that burden heavily, Keegan observed. Felicity's pen stilled. Wouldn't you? If you'd been there when she broke off, the memory still too raw. I found my Sarah, Keegan said quietly. After she and the baby were gone, so yes, I understand something of that burden. The confession hung between them, creating a bridge of shared pain that neither had expected to cross. Felicity felt something shift in her perception of this man who had given them sanctuary. I'm sorry, she whispered, meaning it more deeply than she could express. Keegan nodded once, acknowledgement of both her sympathy and the unspoken understanding between them. So am I, for all you've lost. As April brought green shoots and newborn calves, activity at Sundowner intensified. Keegan hired 2 seasonal hands to help with the expanded herd, but the core operations remained with him and the sisters. Faith revealed an unexpected talent for breeding, her gentle nature perfect for handling nervous cows and their vulnerable offspring. Felicity, meanwhile, threw herself into preparing fields for crops, a new venture for Sundowner that Keegan had agreed might provide additional security against cattle market fluctuations. She worked from sunrise to sunset, her skin browning under the strengthening sun, her muscles hardening with honest labor. Keegan found her one evening as dusk painted the sky in spectacular colors, still working a stubborn patch of ground with single-minded determination. You'll work yourself into collapse at this rate, he said, echoing her words to him months earlier. Felicity paused, wiping sweat from her brow. There's still daylight. Barely, Keegan countered, taking the tool from her hands despite her protest. You've accomplished more in a day than most men do in 3, she bristled slightly. I'm not trying to prove anything, aren't you? He asked gently. Faith has settled in, found her place, but you're still fighting, Felicity. What enemy are you battling out here in this field? The question struck too close to truths she wasn't ready to examine. I'm ensuring our security, she replied stiffly. This land needs to produce if we're all to survive. Keegan studied her for a long moment. The land will still be here tomorrow. Come watch the sunset with me. Something in his tone made it impossible to refuse. They walked to a small rise overlooking the ranch, settling on a fallen log as the sky erupted in brilliant oranges and purples. I come here sometimes to remember why I fight so hard, Keegan said after a comfortable silence. The land gives back what you put into it, but it demands balance too. Felicity felt the tension slowly draining from her shoulders. It's beautiful. Yes, Keegan agreed, though when she glanced over, she found him looking at her rather than the horizon. The intensity in his gaze sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with her day's exertion. He looked away first. Your sister mentioned it will be your birthday soon. Felicity blinked in surprise. Faith talks too much. Keegan's laugh was a rare and pleasant sound. She cares about you, as do others. The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge what had been growing over the months of working side by side, of shared meals and quiet evenings, of building something meaningful together. The calm of early spring shattered in late April when Thornton made good on his veiled threats. Keegan rode out at dawn to check on a pregnant heifer and returned mid-morning with fury etched in every line of his face. The north pasture fence has been cut in 3 places, he announced as he strode into the kitchen where the sisters were preparing seed packets. Cattle are scattered halfway to the mountains. Faith gasped. Who would do such a thing, Thornton? Felicity stated, already rising to her feet. Or his men, Keegan nodded grimly. Likely, no proof, of course. What do we do? Faith asked. Round up what we can, Keegan replied. I've sent Lewis and Tom to start gathering them, but we'll need every hand. The day that followed was grueling. Felicity, who had learned to ride with surprising skill over the winter months, worked alongside Keegan tracking cattle through increasingly rough terrain. Faith and the hired hands managed the closer strays, bringing them back to the safety of the main pasture. As evening approached, Keegan and Felicity found themselves miles from the ranch house, following the trail of 3 particularly valuable heifers. We should head back, Keegan said reluctantly as shadows lengthened. It's not safe out here after dark. Felicity shook her head stubbornly. Those are pregnant cattle worth more than all the others combined. We keep looking. A flash of admiration crossed Keegan's face. You've become quite the rancher, Felicity Andrews. I've had a good teacher, she replied, surprised by the softness in her own voice. They rode in companionable silence until they spotted the missing cattle in a small clearing, seemingly unharmed. Relief washed over them both. Thank God, Keegan murmured. Let's get them moving before the gunshot cracked through the evening air like thunder, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Felicity felt rather than saw Keegan jerk in his saddle. Keegan, she cried, watching in horror as crimson stained his shirt. Get down, he ordered through gritted teeth, sliding from his horse and pulling her with him behind the shelter of a fallen tree. The cattle scattered, forgotten in the immediate danger. You're hit, Felicity said, her hands already moving to examine the wound in his upper arm. Grazed, Keegan corrected, though pain tightened his features. Not life-threatening. Who's shooting at us? Felicity whispered, peering cautiously over their makeshift barrier. 3 guesses and the first 2 don't count, Keegan replied grimly, drawing his revolver with his good arm. Another shot splintered bark near their heads. Felicity ducked instinctively, her heart pounding. We're pinned down. Not for long, Keegan stated, checking his ammunition. When I return fire, you run for the horses, get back to Sundowner and bring help. I'm not leaving you, Felicity protested. This isn't a negotiation, Keegan said, his voice hardening. You're faster and I'm wounded. One of us needs to make it back. Before she could argue further, he raised himself slightly and fired 3 rapid shots toward the origin of the attack. Go now, instinct and training took over. Felicity sprinted for the horses, keeping low. She'd almost reached them when she heard a pained grunt behind her. Turning, she saw Keegan slumping against the log, fresh blood darkening his shirt near his ribs. In that moment, everything crystallized for Felicity. The months of working together, of rebuilding their lives, of quiet conversations and shared dreams, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. She loved this stubborn, honorable man who had asked for nothing while giving everything. With a reckless courage born of that realization, she doubled back, half dragging Keegan to his feet. We're leaving together or not at all, she declared, helping him onto his horse. Another shot whistled past them as they mounted, but Felicity had already urged the horses into motion, leading them down a steep embankment and into the shelter of a dense copse of trees. That was foolish, Keegan managed through pain-whitened lips once they'd put some distance between themselves and their attackers. Probably, Felicity agreed, keeping a steady hand on his reins to guide his mount. But I'm not attending another funeral this year, Keegan Kirkland. Especially not yours. They reached Sundowner after nightfall to find the ranch in an uproar. Faith ran to meet them, her face streaked with tears of relief that quickly turned to horror at the sight of Keegan's blood-soaked clothing. "Get him inside," she ordered, immediately taking charge. "Lewis, ride for the doctor in town." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Faith, who had often assisted their mother in caring for injured farmhands, cleaned and bandaged Keegan's wounds with deft hands. The bullet that had struck his side had passed clean through, painful but miraculously missing vital organs. "He needs rest now," Faith told Felicity gently after Keegan had finally fallen asleep under the influence of laudanum. "You should rest too." Felicity shook her head, taking up position in a chair beside his bed. "I'm staying." Faith studied her sister's face with growing understanding. "You care for him deeply, don't you?" "I love him," Felicity admitted simply, the words easier now that they'd been acknowledged in her own heart. "I think I have for months," Faith smiled softly. "He feels the same, you know. I've seen how he looks at you when you're not watching." Felicity's gaze returned to Keegan's sleeping form. "Thornton won't stop. This was a warning. Next time he'll aim to kill." "Then we need to ensure there isn't a next time," Faith replied with unexpected steel in her voice. Dawn brought the doctor from Durango, who confirmed Faith's assessment and prescribed rest for Keegan, advice everyone knew the stubborn rancher would ignore as soon as he was able. By mid-morning, Keegan was awake and insisting on being brought up to date on the ranch operations. Felicity reluctantly reported that they'd recovered most of the scattered cattle, though the 3 valuable heifers remained missing. "We need to report this to the sheriff," Faith insisted. Keegan's laugh held no humor. "Sheriff Willows is in Thornton's pocket, has been for years." "Then we fight our own battles," Felicity stated, her resolve hardening, but not by stooping to their level. That afternoon, while Keegan rested under Faith's watchful eye, Felicity rode into Durango. Her first stop wasn't the sheriff's office, but the offices of the Durango Daily Chronicle. Editor Joshua Reynolds was initially skeptical of her story, but became increasingly interested as she laid out the pattern of intimidation and violence. "You're saying Marcus Thornton is behind this?" "I'm saying a prominent rancher seems determined to drive a smaller operation out of business through increasingly criminal means," Felicity replied carefully, "and that the local law enforcement seems curiously uninterested in investigating." Reynolds stroked his beard thoughtfully. "That's a dangerous accusation to publish. More dangerous than being shot for protecting what's yours," Felicity countered. Her next stop was the Territorial Bank, where she requested a meeting with the manager who had allegedly lost Keegan's payment the previous year. "I have no idea what you're referring to," the nervous man insisted when confronted. "I think you do," Felicity replied coolly, "and I think there would be records of such a transaction, records that might interest the banking commissioner in Helena if they were tampered with." She left with the man's sweating promise to look into the matter, and a growing sense that their strategy might work. The final piece fell into place at the general store, where she overheard 2 of Thornton's men boasting about cattle bearing the Sundowner brand being moved to a hidden pasture in the hills. Armed with this information, Felicity returned to Sundowner to find Keegan sitting on the porch despite Faith's protests. His face brightened visibly at the sight of her, then tensed as he registered her expression. "What have you done?" he asked as she dismounted. Felicity straightened her shoulders. "Planted seeds. Some will take time to grow, but others." She handed him a folded paper, a special edition of the Chronicle hot off the press, with the headline, "Cattle Rustling and Intimidation. Is Durango Becoming Lawless?" Keegan read it with widening eyes. "Reynolds printed this, with no names mentioned," Felicity pointed out. "But anyone in town will know who it refers to, and I know where our missing cattle are." That evening, as they discussed strategy around the kitchen table, a knock at the door interrupted their planning. Faith opened it to reveal Sheriff Willows, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "Evening, folks," he said, removing his hat. "Got some information about those missing cattle of yours, Kirkland." Keegan's expression remained neutral. Is that so, Sheriff? Seems they were found up in Bitter Creek Canyon, Willows continued, studiously avoiding everyone's eyes. Got an anonymous tip, cattle's being returned tomorrow. After the sheriff departed, Keegan turned to Felicity with a mixture of admiration and concern. What exactly did you say to people in town? The truth, she replied simply. Sometimes that's weapon enough. The following week brought rapid changes to Sundowner. The missing cattle were indeed returned, mysteriously appearing in the south pasture overnight. The bank manager sent written confirmation that all of Keegan's payments were properly recorded and his mortgage in good standing. Most telling of all, Marcus Thornton was suddenly called east on urgent family business, according to town gossip. You've accomplished more with words than I managed in years of standoffs, Keegan told Felicity as they walked the repaired fence line together. His arm was still in a sling, but he insisted on overseeing the ranch's recovery himself. Words backed by truth have power, Felicity replied. And I had something worth fighting for. Keegan stopped walking, turning to face her fully. And what was that? Felicity met his gaze steadily. This land, this life we're building. She paused, gathering courage. Something powerful flickered in Keegan's eyes. Felicity, he said softly, her name a caress on his lips. When you and Faith came to Sundowner, I was drowning. The ranch was failing, and I was too proud to admit I couldn't save it alone. You saved us, Felicity countered. When we had nothing, Keegan shook his head. We saved each other. And somewhere along the way, I found myself looking forward to each morning because it meant seeing your determination, your strength, your heart. He stepped closer, his free hand gently cupping her cheek. I never expected to feel this way again after Sarah. Never wanted to. But loving you isn't a choice I made, Felicity. It's simply the truth of who I am now. Tears pricked at Felicity's eyes. I thought I was being foolish, a woman with nothing to offer except her labor. You've offered me a future, Keegan whispered. Hope, a reason to build something lasting. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise rather than a passion. When they parted, Felicity saw her own wonder reflected in Keegan's eyes. Faith will be delighted, Felicity said with a soft laugh. She's been dropping hints for weeks. Keegan smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Your sister sees more than she lets on. May brought wildflowers to the Montana plains and a proposal that surprised no one at Sundowner Ranch. The wedding was a simple affair held on the property, with Reverend Walsh officiating and half the town in attendance curious to witness the union that had become something of a local legend after the Chronicle's veiled exposé. Faith, radiant in a dress she had sewn herself, stood proudly as her sister's maid of honor. Mother would be so proud of us, she whispered as they prepared in the upstairs bedroom that the sisters would no longer share. Felicity, wearing their mother's carefully preserved wedding dress, blinked back tears. Do you think so, after everything? Because of everything, Faith replied firmly. We survived, Felicity. More than that, we've flourished, and now you've found love with a good man. The ceremony itself was brief, but heartfelt. Keegan, looking uncomfortable but determined in his best suit, spoke vows that made even the most hardened ranchers in attendance clear their throats emotionally. Felicity, who had always prided herself on practical strength, found her voice trembling as she promised to stand beside this man through all of life's challenges. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Walsh declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns hanging from trees. Faith had outdone herself with the preparations, ensuring every detail was perfect for her sister's special day. As twilight deepened, Keegan drew his new wife away from the festivities to the small rise where they had watched the sunset together months before. I have something for you, he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. A wedding gift. Felicity unwrapped it to find a deed newly registered with both their names. Sundowner Ranch, she read aloud, property of Keegan and Felicity Kirkland. It's as much yours as mine now, Keegan explained. Legally as well as in truth, what we've built here, we've built together. Felicity traced the document with trembling fingers. I never imagined owning land again after we lost the farm. There's more, Keegan said, visibly nervous now. Turn it over. On the reverse was a separate deed for a smaller parcel of land adjacent to Sundowner. For Faith, Felicity read, understanding dawning. Keegan nodded. When she's ready, whether she chooses to marry or remain independent, she'll have her own place, land that can never be taken from her. Tears flowed freely down Felicity's cheeks. You're an extraordinary man, Keegan Kirkland. He drew her into his arms, his kiss deeper now, filled with promise. And you, Mrs. Kirkland, are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. By the following spring, Sundowner Ranch had transformed. The main house boasted new additions, including a proper parlor and an expanded kitchen. The crops Felicity had championed were thriving, providing diversified income alongside the growing cattle operation. Faith had taken charge of a new venture breeding horses, displaying a natural talent that attracted buyers from as far as Denver. She lived still at Sundowner, though she had begun making plans for her own small house on the adjoining property Keegan had deeded to her. Most significant of all was the nursery being prepared in what had once been the sisters' shared bedroom. Felicity, now 6 months with child, directed operations with the same determination she brought to everything else, while Keegan alternated between proud anticipation and nervous terror at the prospect of fatherhood. What if I'm not good at it? He confessed one night as they lay together, his hand protectively covering the swell of her stomach. Being a father, Felicity covered his hand with her own. You'll be wonderful, you already care so deeply. I couldn't bear to lose you, he whispered, the old fear surfacing. Not like Sarah. You won't, Felicity assured him, though she understood the fear was beyond rational reassurance. Dr. Miller says I'm strong as an ox and healthy as can be. In July of 1877, Margaret Faith Kirkland entered the world after a difficult but ultimately successful birth. Her lusty cries echoing through Sundowner Ranch as dawn broke over the Montana plains. Named for both their mothers, she had Keegan's wheat-colored hair and Felicity's determined chin. Faith, who had assisted the doctor throughout her sister's labor, wept openly when the healthy baby was placed in Felicity's arms. Keegan, allowed into the room once both mother and child were cleaned and comfortable, stood speechless in the doorway, overcome by the sight of his wife and daughter. Come meet your daughter, Felicity called softly, holding out her hand to him. Keegan approached with reverent steps, sinking to his knees beside the bed. When Felicity placed the tiny bundle in his arms, his expression transformed with a wonder that made her heart swell. She's perfect, he whispered, one calloused finger gently tracing the baby's delicate cheek. Of course she is, Faith said, wiping away happy tears. She comes from perfect love. Over the years that followed, Sundowner Ranch continued to grow and prosper. Faith eventually married Lewis, the ranch hand who had worked alongside them since that first difficult winter, and built her house on the adjoining property close enough for daily visits, but separate enough to establish their own family. Little Margaret Maggie, to everyone but her Aunt Faith, who insisted on using her proper name, was joined by twin brothers 2 years later, and eventually by a youngest sister who arrived when Maggie was 8. The Kirkland children grew up strong and capable, learning the ranch operations from both parents with equal respect for their father's steady wisdom and their mother's innovative spirit. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Keegan and Felicity once again climbed the small rise that had become their special place. The ranch spread below them had grown beyond recognition, expanded pastures, thriving crops, substantial outbuildings, and 2 family homes. Did you ever imagine this when you took in 2 desperate sisters? Felicity asked, leaning comfortably against her husband's shoulder. Keegan shook his head, his arm tightening around her. I was just trying to survive the winter. I never dreamed I'd find my heart again. Felicity smiled, thinking of their children safely tucked in bed under Faith's watchful eye for the evening. I came to repay a debt of kindness, she mused, and found a lifetime of love instead. No debts between us, Keegan reminded her, echoing his words from long ago. Only partnership. Only love. As the sun set over Sundowner Ranch, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had witnessed their first honest conversation, Felicity knew with absolute certainty that the desperate journey that had brought two sisters to this place had led exactly where they were meant to be all along. "No debts," she agreed, turning in his arms to kiss him with the same passion that 10 years of marriage had only deepened. "Only gratitude and joy." And as darkness fell over the Montana plains, the lights of Sundowner Ranch shone like beacons of the hope, determination, and love that had transformed not just a struggling ranch, but the lives of everyone who called it home.